Okay, we are on page 21b, and we've been talking about Taisvis over here, and we got into an interesting discussion about the Hecha Kedusha doing a short repetition of Shemona Esrei. So let's talk about that because Isaac found an interesting article. So let's pull that up, the short mincha, and that article mentioned that the Ramah holds that in an emergency, the Ramah brings it down, chapter 124, that in an emergency, the Chazan should not repeat the Amida, the Shemona Esrei, but rather he does this, begins the prayer out loud, and he says the Kedusha, and at the end of Hakel HaKadosh, he stops and he stops saying it out loud. He proceeds silently. And at the same time, the congregants recite every word in those first three blessings together with the Chazan, and then continue silently on their own. And that's this is the way that it's done. Half a kedusha. That's the way, at least it's mentioned in the Ramah. Now the Beis Yosef says that this was a common Sephardic practice for mincha every day, even without an emergency, but the rabbis tried to stamp it out and excommunicate anyone that was doing it. Now, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef quotes other Sephardic authorities who also oppose this practice, but he does mention that it is allowed. The Ramah says it's allowed in unusual circumstances. Beis Yosef allows the practice when the repetition of the prayer is endangered. If there are only 10 men and they're not going to say Amen to the blessings. So the blessings might be in vain. They're almost in vain, and therefore it's better to do this half a repetition. He brings the Be'er Hativ that there are two different customs, and I think Ezra mentioned it yesterday that Sephardim do word for word. Ashkenazim don't start the Shemona Esrei till afterwards, and then he brings that a Panine Halacha, it must be a rabbi of today. He suggests that Ashkenazi who prays slowly should pray mincha together with the leader so he can finish in time to answer Kaddish. In my experience, he says, if you pray very slowly, try to pray together with the leader, it doesn't work. You may have trouble reaching Kedusha in time. Okay, whatever. Anyway, he brings Rabbi Herschel Schachter, who's a student of Rabbi Soloveitchik, and that he prefers the Sephardic practice. So Ezra, you got Rabbi Schachter on your side over here. He says that it should be, the Kedusha should be part of your Amida prayer. And when the leader is repeating the prayer, he's reciting a prayer as everyone's representative, and the Kedusha is part of it. So that's when he does the Chazaras Hashatz. He's repeating the prayer, and he's the representative. But when he's merely saying it out loud, the Kedusha will only be part of your prayer if you're saying it together with the leader. That's an interesting point. I don't know that I would be ready to change the custom of the Ashkenazic Jews for that, but he seems to think that it's more the Sephardic way of doing word for word is a better way. And his logic is because when you do it word for word, the Kedusha is part of your Shemona Esrei. Otherwise, it's the Chazan's private Shemona Esrei. It's not like a repetition Shemona Esrei. And therefore, he's getting the Kedusha part, but maybe you're not really getting the full merit of it. That's the logic that he gives. I don't know if I buy into that logic, but that's, I can't, Rabbi Soloveitchik is a lot smarter than I am. In any event, he says, while the permission mentioned above only applies to emergencies, he does say that there are a lot of groups that try to expand that or extend that leniency, losing time from their learning in yeshivas. And then he says an interesting thing that Rabbi Kamenetsky said. that the purpose of the repetition was to benefit those that are unlearned and have them in mind. So he says in a yeshiva where everyone knows how to daven, he says that wasn't so applicable. It wasn't applicable. The scholars congregated there, and therefore it wasn't it was recited only in it's had to listen to the purpose of it wasn't for the shul. So that's a very interesting thought. The problem with that is that the Ramah doesn't agree with that. And the Ramah was the leader of all Ashkenazic Jewry, and he said that you cannot rely on this. So he didn't seem to buy into that, but that is an interesting thought that Rabbi Kamenetsky mentions, that the purpose of the repetition was in order to fulfill the obligation for those that are unlearned. And in yeshivas, you didn't have that, so there's really no need for the repetition. That's an interesting svara. It's an interesting thought. But, I don't know that you could take that any further because, we have the Ramah and the Kabbalists, they, and the Sephardic rabbis, they prohibited it. They excommunicated people for doing it. So it doesn't seem to me like it's acceptable to rely on. But it is an interesting thought. Then I see this other article, that there's two reasons for the repetition of Shemona Esrei. One is to help for the people who fulfill their obligations, and the other is to be able to say the Berchas Kohanim. So he says, so number one is you're aiding people who don't know how to daven. He really says three things. Number one is you're aiding people who don't know how to daven. Number two is you're able to do the Kedusha. And number three, you're able to do the Berchas Kohanim. So he says here, the beginning and end of Shemona Esrei, since the beginning and the end of Shemona Esrei must be said, our sages decreed that the whole prayer be recited. This is from the Aruch HaShulchan. So the reason to repeat the first and end brachos is because you need to say Kedusha, the Kadosh, Kadosh, Kadosh. You need to say Berchas Kohanim, and these are both recited as a congregation. And since you need to say the beginning and the end, so therefore they established to say the entire the middle section as well. So he says, if you think about these two reasons, that if the purpose of the repetition is to benefit those who don't know how to repeat it themselves, so that means that all 19 brachas are equally important. Even if a person is pressed for time, you can't leave anything out. But according to the second reason, during Mincha, you don't mention Berchas Kohanim, and therefore, you don't mention Brochos Kohanim. Therefore, the main purpose, according to the second of this reason, would be the Kedusha. So if you're running late, so according to this reason, it should be sufficient to hear the first three brachos and say the Kedusha, and you fulfill the Kedusha aspect of it. So he says,
Rabbi, what about Modim?
That's a good point. It's a good point. Not only Moedim, about the Amen of Shamei Tefillah, which maybe I'll mention it a little later. But yes, that's a very good point. There is reason to say that the Moedim that we recite is more of a not to go against what the Chazan is saying, but it's not the actual recital of Moedim that's so valuable. In other words, Kedusha, the recital of Kedusha is very valuable. the Moedim, it's not about the value of the Moedim, to the extent that it's unclear about even what you're supposed to say with the Moedim, because there were different rabbis had different statements that they would say for Moedim. And even then, what we say is we just combine all of them together. But the actual recital of the Moedim, it could be is not so important. It's more about if the Chazan is bowing and the community is bowing, you should bow along with them. And you should recite it. But the actual recital, there's room to say that, that it's that the recital of Moedim is not the same thing, because you're allowed to say Moedim even without a minyan. You could say Moedim anachnu lach, but the kedusha we only say with a minyan. And of course, you're allowed to say that the angels say kedusha, so therefore, you're allowed to say Uvalatzion without a minyan. You're allowed to say the Brochos Kriya Shema without a minyan, because you're just mentioning that the angels say this. But if you want to do kedusha, you need to have a minyan. But Moedim, you don't necessarily need a minyan for. So therefore, it's more the idea of while the congregation is saying it, you should say it with them. That's more the value of it. So therefore, there would be room to be lenient here. This is a very interesting point that I wish I could. Let's see. He says some halachic authorities allow this practice during mincha under particularly pressing circumstances. So what it seems like is that he's explaining the reason to be lenient for mincha is because of this second reason of why we repeat Shemona Esrei, meaning that for the reason that you have to repeat it for those that are unlearned, that you would always need to repeat Shemona Esrei. But if you are doing it because you need to say Kedusha and Berachos Koyanim, so therefore mincha, there's room to be lenient because you don't have Berachos Koyanim. And therefore, all you need to do is really get the Kedusha, and that you have with the first three brachas, and therefore there would be room to be lenient. But I don't know if I have to look up a Aruch HaShulchan. I don't own an Aruch HaShulchan. I'll have to see if Hebrew Books has one, and see if I could look that up and see if it discusses this this whole idea. In other words, this logic that it's based on these two reasons, and that's the source of doing a half kedusha. It sounds interesting. I just don't know for sure if it's legit. Let's see if we'll have to check out the Aruch HaShulchan.
Rabbi,
yes.
I have two sets. Which are you talking about? The Aruch HaShulchan.
Page chapter 124, Sif 3, Sif Gimel. 124, Sif Gimel. Kuf Chaf Daled, Sif Gimel.
Rabbi, you also missed out on the Amen.
Yeah, all the Amens. You're right. Every Amen, and especially yes. So that's the next thing that I wanted to talk about. And thank you, David and Mel, for bringing this up. There is one thing that I didn't mention yesterday because I didn't want to confuse people too much, but it has to do. It's brought in this Taisvus over here. In order to understand it, we do have to talk. We have to review the Gemara with everyone, so that we'll be able to really, understand what we're dealing with. The Gemara had two views, two opinions, as to the value of the kedusha, value of moedim versus davening the Shemona Esrei right away with the community. And the Gemara tells us that according to Rav Huna, what's most important is to bow down with moedim when the chazan says moedim. And therefore, if you came late to shul, you got to make sure that you'll be available to do the moedim with the congregation. That's very important. Kedusha, Rav Huna says you could really say yourself, which we don't hold that way. But Rav Huna says you could say yourself. So you came late to shul. The group has started Shemona Esrei. If you start Shemona Esrei, you might miss moedim. He says then you have a problem. If you're going to miss moedim when everyone else is bowing for moedim, that's a problem. And therefore, don't daven Shemona Esrei and wait until they say Moedim. If you're gonna finish Shemona Esrei and say Moedim with the congregation, that you do. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi argued. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi said, no, if you could finish before the Chazan gets to Kedusha, then you could daven now. Otherwise, you got to wait. Don't daven now. Wait until they say Kedusha, and you'll say Kedusha. You'll say Kedusha with them, and if you'll finish before they say Kedusha, fine, you could daven. But otherwise, you got to wait. Don't daven yet. Wait until they say Kedusha. The commentaries understand that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi does not argue with Rav Huna. Rav Huna argues with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi does not argue with Rav Huna. What does that mean? Let's take, for example, you came to shul, and you're not going to be able to daven and finish before they say Kedusha. So what do? You wait, right? You got to wait. Wait until the congregation says Kedusha. Now what happens? They're saying Kedusha, you say it with them. Now you want to start davening. What's the din now? Can you start davening now? The Chazan just said Kedusha, you're finished, you answered everything. Now you want to start. So what's the din now? Should you just start? Anyone want to share their
Say it
thoughts?
to yourself, don't you?
You're going to say it to yourself.
Wait
Can you
for
start now?
Moedim.
What?
You have to
Depends.
wait for
According to
Moedim.
Rav Huna, you have to wait till Modim.
According to Rav Huna, you have to wait till Moedim. Now, does Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi argue on that? We hold like Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. But does Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi argue on Rav Huna? We know Rav Huna argues on Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi because Rav Huna says you don't have to wait for Kedusha.
It says.
But does Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi argue on Rav Huna? Does he hold you also have to wait for Moedim?
No. He says you should begin to pray after Kedusha.
Well, he doesn't.
As long as you are able to meet the Chazan at Modim at the same time.
So you think he holds? So we have an argument here. Ruvain says he probably argues on Rav Huna, and Ezra says that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi agrees with Rav Huna. So in Shulchan Aruch, the understanding is that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi agrees with Rav Huna. That's the understanding. It is a little hinted to in the Gemara, because how does the Gemara, Isaac, just give me 1 minute. How does the Gemara explain this argument between Rav Huna and Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi? The Gemara says they argue if you can say Kedusha yourself. That's the Gemara's explanation of the argument. The Gemara doesn't talk about an argument about Moedim, which makes it sound like they agree about Moedim. They disagree about Kedusha. In other words, why would Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi argue with Rav Huna about Moedim? What would the reason be? Why would he say you don't have to do Moedim with the congregation? The congregation is bowing. What would his logic be that you don't have to bow with them? It'll look like you're denying Hashem. And therefore, the Gemara, the understanding, at least in the Beis Yosef, in the Shulchan Aruch, he follows this logic that Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi agrees with Rav Huna. It's Rav Huna that disagrees. It's Rav Huna that disagrees with Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi. Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi agrees with Rav Huna. Therefore, what happens is on a practical level, you came to shul late, you waited all the way for the Chazan. Finally, he says Kedusha, and then we tell you, nope, I don't know if you can start now. You want to start now? They finish Kedusha? Not so fast. Will you finish before the Chazan reaches Moedim now? Now we got to make sure you'll finish before the Chazan reaches Moedim. Now, if you're going to finish before the Chazan reaches Moedim, then you're all set. But if you're not going to finish before the Chazan reaches Moedim, then you got to wait another few minutes. Wait till he reaches Moedim. So this is really this is the understanding of the Gemara. So that basically is pretty much what we learned in the Gemara. Yes, Isaac, what do you see there? There are two opinions.
I sent you the Aruch HaShulchan.
Oh, Shkaya. You sent me the Aruch HaShulchan in a text?
I never saw before how to read Mamela in Hebrew. So I now know how to spell Mamela.
Oh, it's in, Okay, 1 second. I'm trying to make it bigger. I can't go. Oh, okay. So you should know that the Torah writes another reason on Chazor Sashatz because of Kedusha. Look over there, and it seems that he could say, that another point is for Birkas Kayanim, because it's impossible without which would be impossible. That you would say Chazaras Hashatz also because of Birkas Kainim, because it's impossible without saying the last three brachas. So why does Rabbi Gamliel ask the Chachamim, why do we have a Chazaras Hashatz? Well, of course, you need Kedusha, you need Birkas Kainim. And why did the rabbis need to answer to be Moitzi She'enai Baki? So he says it's telling us a very important thing. What happened? They asked the Rambam, what happens in a shul that everyone knows everything? What do you need Chazaras Hashatz for? And he answered them that since the rabbis established it, it's a takana, and there's no difference whether you're Baki or whether you're not Baki. Now, nevertheless, we have to understand, how did they make a takana to daven for nothing when you don't need it? And the answer is, some of it you need. Even besides for the reason of not being knowledgeable, you need the first three for Kedusha and the last three for Birkas Kohanim. But because of Einai Baki, they established to do all of it. So, and since they established it, even if everyone is knowledgeable, you have to do all of it because you need the first three and the last three. So therefore, they established all of them, and there's no you can't make a difference in the takana. So that's based on the Rambam. So that's very interesting. Okay, so now that I've read that, thank you so much, Isaac. That was great. So what that means is they asked the Rambam this interesting question, and this goes back to Rabbi Yaakov Kamenetsky's claim that in the yeshivas they are all Baki. They don't really need the Chazaras Hashatz. But the problem is the Rambam clearly says that they asked the Rambam, they said, we have a shul that everyone is very knowledgeable. We don't want to do the repetition. And the Rambam answered them and said, sorry, guys, you're going to have to do the Chazaras Hashatz. You're going to have to repeat it. And the reason why you're going to have to repeat it is because the rabbis made a decree and there's no way of getting out of it. The rabbis established it and it's a done deal. The Aruch HaShulchan mentions a little explanation. Why is it that the rabbis established such a thing? Didn't they think there might be shuls that people are very knowledgeable? Why would they have established it? He says because you anyway need the first three because Kedusha. You anyway need the last three because of Birchas Kohanim. Therefore, the rabbis established the middle. It was more like it wasn't a total. It's not totally unnecessary. But this is all in the logic. This is not in practical. In practical, you got to say it. In the logic behind it, what's the reason? So he's giving an understanding of why. So this website that I was reading from, he wants to use that as a source of the reason for being lenient if you're an emergency, because according to the logic, the reason why the rabbis established it, you might be able to finagle, excuse that you're in an emergency. So at least get this point. You have this, you don't have that. You'll at least get what, the main thing. You don't have the rabbis established it. You really should say the whole thing. But you can't. You're in an emergency. Fine. At least get the kedusha part because you have it. That so the way that website put it, wanted to make it like a whole reason of it's in its own right. It's not exactly. It's really adapting what the Aruch HaShulchan said. The Aruch HaShulchan doesn't really say that. The Aruch HaShulchan says that it's all one reason. He wants to divide it into two reasons and then give some type of a leniency. But we do know that the Ramah does offer such a leniency, so you can't scream at people who rely on this leniency in a time of urgent matter, a time of emergency. But in general, it seems like from all that we've read, it seems like the appropriate way to daven mincha is to do a full chazaras hashatz, a full repetition. Okay, we had a few questions. I think Ezra had his hand up. Yes.
Yeah. So does that mean that if we were able to get a group of rabbis that were equivalent to the Anshe Knesset Gedolah and bring it up in front of them, they could then overturn and basically say, since we consider most of us to be learned in these times and days, there's no need to repeat it?
There is such a concept that if you're bigger than them in minyan and in knowledge and minyan, I would, if you could find such a group of rabbis, it would be nothing less than Mashiach.
Yep. Amazing.
That would be the revelation. There's nothing less. I can't imagine if you could get rabbis on the level, in the league of the Anshe Knesset Gedolah, that would be the revelation of Torah Chadasha, Me'iti Teitze. That would be the greatest revelation of Mashiach. And I'm sure that would mean the resurrection happened already, because that would mean that it already happened. But yes, that would. As far as I understand, as long as you have a greater bezdin, there are some technical rules about it. But it seems correct. Yes, Susan.
Okay. Two things. When you're talking about a minyan, that means you have to have 10 men plus the rabbi and the chazan, or is it?
No, they're included.
It doesn't need to be a rabbi, and
So it has to be 8 men plus a rabbi and chazan?
No, there's no such thing as a rabbi. A rabbi is a invention. A congregation does not need a rabbi.
You don't have to have a rabbi present to start.
If you have 10 men, you don't need a rabbi.
Oh my gosh, I didn't know that. Okay. All right.
You don't need a rabbi. You don't need a real chazan either. You need someone who leads the service as long as he reads.
Wow.
So that's basically it. We talk about a chazan, but it's really the term as a term that I use. It really is called a shliach tzibur, just someone who's going to lead the congregation for the prayer, which means he's going to read out loud. That's all it is. It's not a real chazan. And a rabbi is not a necessity. It's
the other thing is
it's a necessity to have a rabbi, but it doesn't have to be there in your shul. You need to have a rabbi so you can ask questions. Right. You got to have someone who you can ask questions to. Nowadays, Google is a very knowledgeable rabbi. But
all right.
You have to be careful what you get from Google. Yeah. As we just saw, these sort of things could be adapted a little and manipulated. Right. But yes.
Okay. The other thing is when the service would already start in the temple that I went to, they had ushers that would stop the people if the service was at a point where there's not supposed to be any interruptions. Okay. People would have to stay out of the area. In other words, the ushers would not let you in unless it was a proper time. So there would be a lot of men out in the area doing
in the lobby.
Yes, doing.
Yeah. Well, not just because of proper decorum. They wanted to be with respect. Synagogue should have respect. and that's sometimes when the rabbi speaks, they don't like people going in and out. So
No. But this was for every day. In other words,
that's nice. That's very nice that they had certain parts, certain respect, maybe for the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, which a lot of people
exactly. That's what
maybe that's a very nice thing.
That's what I'm.
It's not. I don't know that it's broad in Shulchan Aruch such a law, but that's a very nice thing to try to encourage and enhance and.
But that's the way the temple ran.
To enforce proper decorum. Okay. Any other questions? Okay, so now we got to get back to the Gemara. So this is yes, David.
Yeah, I'm thinking in terms of. I know we're talking about a mincha, but regarding starting to being able to start after kedusha, to start your Shemona Esrei or not. So what happens Shabbos morning? You don't start your Shemona Esrei when the chazan finishes kedusha. You wait, and then you end up not wanting to daven because they're about to read the Torah, and then after that's done, there's not enough time to daven the first Shemona Esrei because they're going to be doing Musaf, and you're going to end up missing Musaf with a minyan. So you didn't daven the Shemona Esrei with a minyan. You didn't daven Musaf with a minyan. Then what? That's where I'm asking the question.
You better come on time. I mean, this is a big problem. But the Shulchan Aruch does mention that there is one qualification to all this. And that is, if the time of davening is going to end, then don't mind all of these laws. Just daven. If you are up against the clock, if the time to, the maximum time to daven, which according to halacha is the 4 hours of the day. So Shulchan Aruch says that is as far as you can push it. And among Chassidim, a lot of times they rely on a more lenient opinion, which is that, I mean, it's not a lenient opinion. If to get the reward for davening in its time, you need to finish davening by 4 hours. But for some reason, Chassidim were always careful to keep the Chatzos law. They should be careful to keep the Chatzos law, which is midday, which if a person transgresses and doesn't daven by the 4 hours of the day, then they're allowed to daven until midday. That's what it says. Even if you transgressed on purpose, you're allowed to daven until midday. So for some reason, among all Hasidic groups, they always made a big deal about Chatzos, but they didn't make such a big deal about the 4 hours in the day. And I was once davening in a Hasidic shul, and one of the guys mentioned to me, he says, yeah, we don't really follow Shulchan Aruch. We follow what the Rabbonim, what the Rebbe does. And, that's halacha. Shulchan Aruch is written. If you have a shaila, you look in Shulchan Aruch. But if the Rebbe does this, then there's no shaila. That's, of course, the right thing to do. This is what in a Chassidish shtibel, someone once told me. He says, Shulchan Aruch is written when you have a shaila. But if the Rebbe did a certain thing, if their Rebbe did something, of course that's the right thing to do. That you don't look it up in Shulchan Aruch. Therefore, he said we're not makbid on 4 hours in the day. I thought it's an interesting, it's an interesting thought because it's true. The Gemara often uses a story to prove more than logic. Like if you see a Rav did something, if the Rebbe did something like this, that's halacha. That's for sure the halacha. What it says, we'll have to figure out what it means. But anyway, I don't want to get into this. It's an interesting topic, but I didn't really mean to bring that up. But I'm mentioning it because of David's question, which would mean that if midday is approaching, you should daven and not wait to do kedusha and amains and baruch and moedims and all this. You just daven. And if you follow Shulchan Aruch, which is a very nice thing, which is really appropriate, you go by 4 hours. If the 4 hour deadline is approaching, you would definitely limit your chumrah, trying to get kedusha and getting moedim and amens. You would do that only if it's before the end of the 4 hour in the day. Yes, Avram.
I have a quandary why I daven Shemoni Ezra slowly.
Uh-huh.
I have two opinions on this, and I don't know which one to follow, two rabbinical opinions. And now it's time to clear it up, right? So when I am davening and the repetition starts, gets the Kedusha, and one opinion is you stop davening and you just say Kadosh, 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 whatever the precept, and you carry on. The other opinion is I don't stop because it's interrupting Shemona Ezra, and I carry on till I finish. What is the correct way to go? If there is a correct way.
Yeah, there are different different views. In other words, should you daven if a person's going to miss? It's spoken about. I think there's even a tshuva from Rav Moshe Feinstein about this. A person who davens slowly, what should they do? They're going to always miss kedusha. And so if they daven, Shemona Esrei, with the congregation, they didn't come late. They came on time. If they daven with everyone, but they're going to miss kedusha. On the other hand, if they wait for the kedusha, I'm going to miss davening like with the minyan. So it's definitely a question. And then the third option is daven word for word with the chazan. So it'll encourage you you'll be able to keep up because you're saying it word for word with the chazan. So that might be a third option. But I think Rav Moshe says that a person should follow what it says here in Shulchan Aruch about answering the kedusha. I think that's one view. But I will tell you there is a way around this problem, and that is if you daven in a shul where there's more than one minyan, all of these halachas that we're learning, there's one more qualification. Before I said a qualification to what we're learning, and that is if the time of davening is just about over, then you don't follow these laws of answering kedusha. You got to daven. That's one qualification to these laws, is if the time is up, you're up against the clock. The other qualification is, did you already go to another minyan and hear another group or another minyan answer kedusha, answer with that? You answered with them. You already answered to all these responses. So now you could daven at your own pace because you don't need to finish to kedusha because you already heard kedusha today. So if you're in a community that has more than one minyan, let's say they have a 6:30 minyan, a 7:30 minyan, an 8:30 minyan. So you go early and listen to the kedusha from the first minyan, and then when you go to your minyan, you're going to daven at your speed. No problem. You don't have to rush to finish because you already heard kedusha. You already answered amen to all the amens. You already answered maidim. You already did all that. The only thing maybe that you'll do is try to be at a place when the chazan bends down for maidim. You'll bend down for maidim, or if you're not, at least you'd bend down in the middle of Shemona Esrei, in the middle of a bracha, and at least try to do maidim properly. But you're basically fulfilled all the problems. So you live in Boca, right, or in somewhere?
Yeah, Boynton Beach.
Boynton Beach. So there must be more than one minyan, right?
Well, the shul just has the 1 minyan.
Oh, your shul only has one minyan? Uh-huh. There must be more than one shul there, no? Is there more than one shul? There must be a lot of shuls in Boynton. It's a big community, isn't it?
Yeah, there's a Chabad next door, yeah.
And what do they have? Do they have more than one minyan in Chabad?
I'm not sure. I don't know. It's a shul I don't go to.
Okay. Well, I'm just thinking you don't have to go in to answer kedusha. You stand by the window. As long as you hear kedusha and there's no cross or anything in between the the shul and you'd be allowed to there's no idols or anything inappropriate in between. You would be able to answer kedusha with them. So as long as you can hear them saying kedusha, you could answer amen. So even outside. So that would be an option that I see nowadays. It should be a good option that you could answer kedusha without, without. And I will tell you something interesting. According to halacha, you cannot fulfill any obligation by hearing it over a microphone or a telephone. However, if it's live, you can answer amen and kedusha. And there you might have an option of doing it online. You're not fulfilling any mitzvah of Kriyas HaTorah and hearing the Torah reading and all that. But or hearing Megillah, you can't do that on a phone or but you can answer amen and kedusha. And so you could answer maybe to the brachas if you have an online minyan, a real minyan. It has to be a real minyan. That's not, people from all over the world, but it's people in one room davening, and it's online. You could answer to that. That might be another option for you. And you could answer to that kedusha and the amens, and then you fulfilled your obligation, and then go to shul and you daven at your own pace. Daven Yeshman Esrei at your,
Yehesh Rabba too?
Yeah, Yehesh Rabba. Of course you say Yehesh Rabba. Yeah, sure.
The answer is to speed up my davening, really.
What is that?
The answer is to speed up my davening, but still concentrate on it.
Well, I didn't say that, but I gave you a lot of other options. You don't like my options, okay? That's okay, fine. I just threw. Yeah, I don't know why there's so much background noise. Let me mute everyone. Okay, so there's a few more important things that I want to mention. Yesterday, I mentioned to you that there are 2 points in Tosfos that we must go over, and that is that what was the purpose of doing moedim with the community? You don't want to look like you are not bowing while they are bowing. It looks like you're denying God. Now, Tosfos mentions that there is another option, and that is that you don't have to finish davening by the time the other person reaches moedim. You just have to reach moedim when the chazan reaches moedim, and then you're all set. And the truth is, you don't even have to reach moedim. You have to reach a place where you bow in your Shemona Esrei. So if you bow, the first bracha, the beginning of the first bracha, the end of the first bracha, the beginning moedim, or the end of that bracha moedim, which is Hatov Shimcha L'Chana L'Hodos, as long as you reach a place where you bow, you are okay doing your bow at the same time that the congregation is bowing and the chazan is bowing, and you're all set. So the Tosfos is bothered. Why doesn't the Gemara mention this? So he says because it's a little too confusing. It's not so simple to say reach any place where the chazan is up to moedim. It's much more. It just gave the point is you have to bow with the chazan. But really, as long as you reach a place where the chazan will be, where you'll be able to bow, it would also be okay. In other words, in order to say, if the Gemara was going to say this idea, it would have had to mention all 4 places where you bow, and if you reach them, you have to reach each of those 4 places. When it's much easier just to say finish moedim. You finish and you'll be able to say moedim. But really, what it means is, as long as you could say moedim, as long as you could say a proper moedim, then you're fine. So proper moedim is if you finish davening. But really, it also applies if you reach a place where you can say Maidim. Then Tosfos says something else. He says that Rabbeinu Tam used to bow down, even not in one of the places where you're supposed to bow, the 4 places in the Shemona Esrei where you're supposed to bow. Rabbeinu Tam used to, if he was in the middle of Shemona Esrei and the Chazan was saying Maidim, he would go and bow down in the middle of a bracha, anywhere in the middle of Shemona Esrei, anywhere. As long as you're not in the beginning of a bracha or the end of a bracha, as long as you're in the middle of a paragraph, you bow there. You can bow, everyone's bowing. Oh, he bowed, he did his Maidim. He doesn't say Maidim with them, but he bows. That's it. He bows. Now, Tosfos mentions, however, you shouldn't do this. It's preferable not to do this. So what bothers me is, what's the difference between if you bow when you're at the places where you're supposed to bow, or if you bow in the middle of Shemona Esrei where you're allowed to bow? Either way, you're bowing when the Chazan is bowing and when the congregation is bowing. Why the first case, it seems like you're allowed to preferably do that. You could start Shemona Esrei right after Kedusha. You did the Kedusha with the congregation. Start your Shemona Esrei right now, and you'll reach a place where you can bow. The beginning, the end, whatever it is, you'll reach a place where you can bow. That you're allowed to do. But if you're not going to reach a place where you can bow, but you'll bow in the middle of a bracha, that you're not supposed to rely on. Only if you're in the middle of Shemona Esrei and it happens, then you do it. But really, you're not supposed to rely on bowing in the middle of a bracha. But for the other bows, you are allowed to rely on that you'll bow with those bows. So what's the difference? In other words, if you take it a little deeper, my question really is a little deeper. It's, are we afraid that you're going to forget to bow? If we're going to forget to bow, you're also going to forget to align where you're supposed to bow with the Chazan, with the community's bow of Maidim. In other words, if we're afraid you're going to forget there also. Even if you're going to bow with the congregation or you're going to bow in the middle, both places, if you're going to forget, you'll forget both. Why is one better than the other? So it seems, and I may be wrong, but this is what it seems. Yes, David.
Yeah, I was going to say that the person's bowing by Modim in order to be part of the congregation. But if you're holding in one of the other 3 bows, it's a visibly different type of bow. If everybody's bowing for Modim and you're bowing a different type of bow, it's visibly physically different. You're not bowing the same as everybody else. Then what? It looks like you're bowing differently, or you don't know how to bow. And then somebody will say, you don't bow like that. You're bowing the wrong way. And you have to tell them, well, I was bowing for Modim while you're bowing for something else, or vice versa.
That's a good question. I did think about that. David is bringing up an interesting point. When you bow for Modim, you basically just bend your waist. But when you bow for the other 3, you bend your knees and your waist. So it is visibly different. Now, if you take a look in Shulchan Aruch, let's just pull this up right here in chapter 109. The Alter Rebbe brings V'hu Hadin, the same law applies if you could reach Maidim or one of the brachos that you bow, and when you reach it, when the Shliach Tzibur reaches Maidim, then you can daven. And even though that you can't say Maidim with the Tzibur, that the Tzibur is saying, it's no problem because you're bowing with them. So the Alter Rebbe clearly says that it doesn't matter, that your bow is a little different. But it is very surprising because then the Alter Rebbe brings that if you'd started davening and the Chazan reaches Moedim, and you're in one of the middle brachos, you needed to start davening because you said the bracha Gol Yisrael, you can't wait. So you started davening, and then the Chazan reaches Moedim. If you're in one of the middle brachas, in the middle of a bracha, you're in other words, the middle of a paragraph, I should say, not the middle of a bracha, the middle of a paragraph. So you would be allowed to bow down in the middle of all of these paragraphs. But if you don't need to start, you shouldn't rely on this. Don't start and rely on the fact that you'll bow in the middle of one of these paragraphs, because maybe you won't be able to calculate it that you'll be in the middle of the paragraph when the Chazan reaches Moedim. But rather you'll be in the beginning or in the end of a bracha, and you're not allowed to do that. And if you do concentrate too much on this, you won't be able to have right kavanah. So I don't understand, why is that different than if you could reach Moedim or one of the brachas that you bend down at, then then you could bow down with them. Why is that different? It is very surprising. When we're nervous that you won't reach, what would the difference be? So I did see a little source for this, but I'm not 100% sure if this is the answer. Again, we're dealing with an issue here of what is the difference between bowing down at the other three, relying on the fact that you're going to bow down at the other, you reach one of the places where you can bow, or if you're going to bow in a place where you're allowed to bow, like in the middle of a paragraph. Why is there a difference? So it could be that there's two parts to bowing with the congregation. One is the fact that you're bowing with them, and the other is to recite words of praise. And if you're bowing and reciting words of praise, that's preferable. That's fine. As long as you're bowing and you recite, that's what we want. We want you to bow and recite words of praise, even if you're not saying the exact same words. So all the other bows in the Shemona Esrei, you're reciting words of praise. But this bow, when you're bowing in the middle of a bracha, you're not allowed to say anything. You're in the middle of a paragraph, you just bow. That bow, you're not saying anything, you're just bowing. You're not participating in the community's bowing with words of praise. That is a problem. Now, I don't like this explanation so much because it doesn't fit into the Alter Rebbe's words. I don't know if it'll fit. Let's see if the regular Shulchan Aruch Kuf Tes, chapter 109. So in the regular Shulchan Aruch, it seems it also seems it says the same law. So it's all based on this Tosfos, that there's a difference between these two cases. And he says the same reason. Maybe you're going to forget to bow because you're not obligated to bow there. And if you concentrate too much, you won't. So he seems they're bringing from the Magen Avram this idea. Very interesting that they both say this. It sounds like we're more nervous that you'll forget to bow. For some reason, if you don't need to bow, you're going to forget to bow. But if you calculated that you'll actually reach a place where you're supposed to bow, that we're not afraid you'll forget. That's what it sounds like the correct difference is. And it's not connected to the wording that you're saying words or not. Okay, I got into this more technical issue here, and but I did want to touch upon that. And then the other point that I want to touch upon, I know my time is up, but I'm going to take an extra minute or two, and that is that they bring a Yerushalmi, and the Yerushalmi mentions that the main thing is to be able to answer Amen. That you want to, if you're going to start Shemona Esrei, the congregation is going to, the Chazan is going to say his repetition and you're going to miss. Make sure that you don't miss the Amens. Make sure that you say the Amens with the congregation. Which Amen are we talking about? So there's an argument. And one opinion is the Amen of Hakel HaKadosh, and the other opinion is the Amen of Shemei Tefillah. That these two Amens are very important Amens that you can't miss. So we spoke until now about what are the important parts of the Shemona Esrei that you don't want to miss out on the responses. The Kedusha, the Moedim, and now we have the Amen of Hakel HaKadosh and the Amen of Shemei Tefillah. These two Amens are very important as well. So we've now added two more parts of the Shemona Esrei that you don't want to miss out on. And these are also factors that you have to factor in. Are you going to be able to finish Shemona Esrei in time to answer these Amens? Now, what else does this apply to? What it basically shows us is how important these responses are. If someone asks you, what are the most important things to respond to in davening, what would you tell them? Well, Kedusha is a very important thing to respond to. The Amen of Hakel HaKadosh, the Amen of Shemei Tefillah, the Moedim. These four things are very important. And the truth is there's two more things, Baruch Hu and Amen Yehi Shmei Rabbah. So these are six things that are very important. And where does it apply? In the middle of Brochos Kriyas Shema. If you're in the middle of Shema, you do answer to these things. You answer to Shemei Tefillah, you answer to the Amen of Hakel HaKadosh, you answer. So these laws apply in other areas as well. We're talking about how important it is that you push off your davening, the repetition, in order to answer. You push off your davening because you want to answer to the repetition. But really, these laws apply to other areas as well. It just shows the importance of these responses. And this is based on the Yerushalmi, these Amens. And at least the Ramah brings it down as a halacha that in other words, it's not arguing on the Bavli. In other words, you could think that maybe that's an argument on our Gemara. Our Gemara says Kedusha and Moedim. And it could be there are those that see it that way, that the Yerushalmi is arguing on our Gemara. But at least the halacha seems to follow that Yerushalmi. So it must be that the reason we follow that is because we are learning that it doesn't argue. It's just explaining our Gemara that Kedusha includes the Amen of Hakel HaKadosh and Moedim really includes the Shemei Tefillah Amen. Somehow it's not an argument on our Gemara, and therefore, because otherwise normally we would paskin like a Bavli, the Talmud Bavli, the Babylonian Talmud versus the Yerushalmi. And if that Yerushalmi is arguing on our Gemara, it's surprising that we would follow it. But therefore, it must be that we are following the understanding that it doesn't argue on our Gemara, but rather it goes hand in hand with our Gemara. So that I think covers this sugya. This more or less covers it. And tomorrow, Metz Hashem, Rabbi Dalfin will do the Chassidus. He wasn't available today. Okay, have a wonderful day, everyone. Sei gesund.
Thank
Thank you, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you.